So, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, happy lunchtime from wherever in the world you are joining us. My name is Michael, and it's my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Tim Jones. Thanks for being with us, Tim. For all of you might know Tim, he's an ISPIM veteran and a very good friend of the ISPIM family. He's the program director of futureagenda.org, which is the world's largest and most active open innovation program. He's the author of something like 12 books. He will give his speech on the 10 key innovation challenges for the next decade. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thanks for the invitation to be part of this. What I'd like to do is share a little bit of context, just 2 or 3 slides of context for those who don't know about the Future Agenda program, and then get into 10 things which are selected intentionally to provoke debate and discussion about what may be some of the lasting changes for the next 10 years. So lots of stuff done over the years. If I go back 10 years, 50 things were identified, whole range of things that have now all come to pass. Clearly, the one on the top right, we didn't necessarily want to be true, but it was. As with everything else, the people we've engaged with over the years have been really good at accurately anticipating what's going to be important, but more importantly, when is it going to have impact. So around about an 80% success rate in getting these things right. And then 5 years ago, we did 120 face-to-face workshops in 1 year, all over the place, talking to lots of different people. And here's just 5 other things that we now take for granted as being big issues for innovation, big issues for policy going forward. So having done those in the past, the challenge this year was how to do the whole thing digitally. How could we do it via virtual workshops and engagement? And I think we've managed to, I mean, I would definitely say it hasn't been the same as face-to-face, but we've run around about 100 workshops at various levels, and we've talked to lots and lots of people, lots more interviews than we would normally do. So what we've got now is effectively a whole host of things which will be going onto the Future Agenda website over the next month or so. And this is the headline view of what are the 10 things that people are saying around the world that may challenge some of our assumptions, may well validate some of them, and a couple of them may also surprise a couple of people in the different contexts. So I'm going to spend about 10-15 minutes talking through these, and then I'm hoping we can have a discussion about which ones you particularly think will have the biggest impact in 10 years' time, but also some of the nuances around where the innovation opportunities are and what we can do about it. So first of all, big picture, if 5 years ago everyone was talking about China and this being the China century, I think the conversation has nuanced slightly now, and people are increasingly talking about the E7 and not the G7 as their sort of shorthand for not just the shift of power from west to east, but also the rising influence that places like Indonesia, Turkey, and Mexico are having alongside India and China. So I think if we think 10 years out, it won't just be that the E7 countries' economies have grown, pretty much catching up, but heading towards catching up the G7. But you're going to find things like standard setting, like their roles on international bodies, their influence, going to the previous conversation, via the UN, increasingly apparent to more people. So big picture, we used to think it was US shifting to China. I think now it's this sort of look at the East through the E7 lens, because that's going to be significant. Cutting across, and this was something which we've sort of been bubbling around for quite a while, cutting across a lot of the assumptions that people make is that we're in a digital world and that data flows freely and that we can make the most of the information available by getting access to that. And that clearly is no longer true. There's, at last count, 85 countries around the world that stop some or all of their data crossing their national boundaries. Specific examples would be, health data is not allowed outside Singapore, health data is not allowed outside South Africa, but also you're getting sort of financial data being restricted. And then in other places, it's a complete, almost like a whole barrier, that wall that's being put up to say, this is not about us just keeping a copy of our data in country X or country Y and letting other places, whether it's China, Germany, the US, do with what they will with their copies. This is about not letting data out of our countries. So a good simple example would be in Rwanda, where they fined their mobile phone company for just simply storing their data over the border in Kenya. And although this doesn't make economic sense in many places, that doesn't stop it from growing. This is about politics, this is about emotion, and this is about culture. Now, our conversations across Africa last year said the data is just the latest example of the West coming in, taking what's our resource and making money out of it. And we're not going to let it happen. So I think this is a big sort of sense check for lots of people about, well, is our digital strategies really in tune with the way that the whole world is going, not the way that maybe some of us in some countries think is important. Positive notes, the whole sort of climate change shifts and impacts of global warming, other than for a few naysayers, is pretty much central stage now. The direction of travel is clear. It's all about speed. How quickly can we get to net zero? Is it 2050? Is it 2040? Is it 2030? Or even quicker? And I think because the costs of things like solar have come down, the technology, as you know, has been shown in Australia about high voltage DC transmission, are all now coming to fruition. This is about which countries, which cities are going to be most proactive. I think everybody has sort of pointed at Paris and Oslo and Mexico City, largely because their mayors have been so forthright in saying we're going to get there, and the cities are going to move the countries forward. But you're starting to get momentum and almost, as I said, competition between countries and cities to be there first and to make the green economy work without subsidy and work for all. And the costs are coming down. It's about sort of linking the regulation and the space in terms of that. One specific example, we talked about this earlier last year, the whole idea of electric planes, which pre-lockdown people were saying, oh, we're never going to stop flying. We definitely need to keep existing planes going. Sentiment seems to have changed, that maybe when we do go back to large scale flying, the opportunity to fast track this, the technologies could well occur. Scandinavia is aiming for all domestic flights to be electric by 2040. Will that come forward? Is that going to move to 2035? And if short haul, medium haul electric planes can have the impact, how long will it be before that affects how we think about traveling long haul? Probably it's 2050, 2060 for that technology. But will it change our behaviors and our attitudes if going electric within a region, within a continent is easy? How will we view long-haul intercontinental travel? Going on to other areas, I think this one and this phrase sort of summarizes quite a big shift, that the whole CSR agenda and ESGs, which have been on the periphery of many businesses, have now become very much center stage. And one of the underlying changes, this shift from a shareholder to a stakeholder society, seems to have just built up enough momentum to say by 2030, maybe we'll be there. You know, there's a lot of people pushing back and saying, well, is there a different alternative to capitalism? Probably not. But is there a different way of structuring how we organize and run our businesses? There's lots of examples now, whether it's Danone, whether it's Unilever, whether it's Patagonia, of companies who are successful by having a different attitude. You know, there's a great piece of research undergoing at the moment, The Future of the Corporation, which is being hosted by the British Academy. And that's really locking in what it is that companies will see as a priority as they go forward. So it's been on, as I said, this is not a new thing. It's just sort of, it's hit that tipping point now where instead of being a side issue, it's becoming mainstream. On sort of the disease side of things, although clearly for all the right reasons, our attention has been focused on the coronavirus pandemic this year and dealing with it. When you actually talk to people about things like impact in terms of deaths over the next decade, 20 years or so, they actually point to old diseases. They actually point to things like malaria, like Lyme's disease, and say, you know, the problem that we've got is that old diseases are increasingly moving into different nations. These are not things that we don't know anything about, but they're things that lots of countries have forgotten to deal with. So they're not necessarily completely alert. So as climate change increases the temperatures and mosquitoes start moving more and more and you can't stop them, how does public health systems better engage people about these rather dull but really scary and in terms of their impact diseases, and how do you persuade people to change their behaviors around being able to help deal with the outbreaks and stop this? And then lastly, on the environmental perspective, and we tested this out sort of April last year, and it's really caught a sweet spot. This is sort of the overlap between nature, conservation of nature, biodiversity, and what's fundamentally happening. And I think the best way of explaining this is, if 10 years ago, people were really worried about water quality, 5 years ago, they were worried about air quality. Now, the thing that's there on people's attention is, well, what about our soil? We take it for granted. It's increasingly overstressed, overburdened, trying to feed so many people. It impacts everything. And is this going to be the decade where we start to pay attention to something which we have basically, we walk on it every day, we ignore it, but it is vital to life. So will the whole nature debate, arguably, and biodiversity and everything focus on soil in the same way as climate change was going on as a big discussion, greenhouse gases, but it was air quality that sort of acted as a tipping point for the person on the street to be worried and take action. So just a question, have we had water quality appear, air quality, and now we're into soil quality as one of the big issues? Last three, moving on to sort of the tech space. We've all, I'm sure, in and around innovation, been hearing about personalization and customization for the past 20 years. But in the past, we always talked about that in terms of smaller segmentation of marketplaces down to sort of groups that we can use mass customization approaches on. I think what we're hearing is that the reality of individual personalization, so at the n=1 level, is credible now for the next decade. It's increasingly focused on services, but also entertainment experiences. And the things that are coming together are really three things. First of all, facial recognition is becoming increasingly ubiquitous. Certain countries, the Chinas of the world, have got it very strongly, but it's also embedded inside most transport infrastructure. It's in many large cities, and it's increasingly being made more cheaply available. But allied to that, the whole digital identity space, sort of that gap in between your passport and your bank account, is something that the banks and lots of partnerships are now starting to say, can everybody in the world have a digital ID? And what does that enable them to do? That's coming on strong. At the same time, there's a lot more of the AI is becoming more credible in knitting everything together. So those sort of three things, the infrastructure of facial recognition, the principles of digital identity, and the technology of artificial intelligence are sort of all coming together, and people are saying we can finally get true personalization of experiences. And then lastly, two that sort of haven't necessarily become just out of the pandemic, but have been massively accelerated by the pandemic. I don't think there's many trends that people would say have come completely out of nowhere in the past 10 months, but lots of things have moved quicker than they were beforehand. And one of them is around supply chains and supply webs. The first few months, March, April, and May, you had food companies, you had supermarkets all sharing their networks and sharing their supply chains to get stuff to where it needed to be. Things that had previously been forbidden for competitive reasons were put aside. It was a case of what's the most effective way of getting stuff to where it needs to be. And what that has opened the door to is this discussion about maybe we stop talking about supply chains where one company owns or controls its own supply chain, and we move to more flexible and shared webs where there are more networks and systems of competitors sharing talent, sharing infrastructure, and sharing access to key materials. So is the next decade about we're going to be designing products around secure global supply chains, but resilience and backup plans are going to be far more part of it as we shift away from that super efficient, just-in-time single supply chain. And then lastly, and this comes with a sort of caveat as to, will this be a 2030 thing or could this be a 2022 thing? Will we have a situation now that vaccines for COVID are in the mix where your proof of immunity will become more important than your identity? And that maybe if you can prove that you are healthy and not carrying, whether it's this pandemic or the next pandemic, it will be your immunity to disease that allows you access to a country, to a city, or to a building going forward, rather than necessarily your citizenship and who you are and who you work for. So you're seeing governments, some of the technology companies that have been working with a lot of governments on the data side of dealing with COVID are the same technology companies that deal with the, they manage the US border processes. They manage a lot of the data around identity. So are we going to get to a point that health data and your personal data start to become meshed and interwoven such that they make immunity one of the big issues for the next decade? So there's 10. I'm just going to go back to the starting of that. As I said at the beginning, this is very sort of our suggestion from the discussions that we've had during the year. We haven't finished the final synthesis, but these are the 10 that personally I think are maybe up for debate. And I wondered, conscious of sort of time to have a chat, I wondered whether we wanted to have a little bit of a discussion around this. And I think we might even have a poll ready to run to see which ones people wanted to talk about more. Yes, as if by magic, Ian's just put up a Zoom poll. Could everybody choose, out of the 10 I gave, could you choose the 3 that you think are potentially going to have greatest impact? And then maybe we can talk about those in more detail. There's obviously a whole range there that cover quite a broad spectrum. But if we could just put those up, then maybe Michael, you and I can start a discussion when we see the gaps. Or while we're waiting for that to come in, Michael, do you have any initial comments to yourself?
So as we are waiting for the results from somehow all over the world, some of the 10 most important trends that you showed for 2030, thanks for your presentation, by the way, they're very much sustainability oriented. So could it be that the next decade is somehow the merging of sustainability and innovation, or am I overdoing it?
No, I think you're spot on. We've just been doing some work on the future of work. And one of the points of view there about jobs in the 2030 is that every job is going to be a green job. Every job is going to directly or indirectly somehow be influenced by climate change. And so this whole issue that it's an option is no longer there. So yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's too simplistic just to say sustainability is the trend. It's how it's going to impact in different areas, and it's interesting that the race to net zero has gone to the top of the of people's polls. Anybody want to ask any specific questions about any of these top-rated ones? We've got the race to net zero at the top. We've also got the E7 data sovereignty, but also stakeholder society. and proof of immunity. So quite a good spread there. Anybody want to do through Michael or by chat?
So you can switch your microphones on if you want. If you are still dressed, you also can switch your cameras on. So it's quite strange that we are looking just into lots of black screens here. So there's a question from Stiglund Palesgard. What primary drives the race to net zero? So I think this is actually the question that I wanted also to ask. So it was the most voted question. So what are the primary drivers in this race to net zero? Is it just cars and electric cars? Is it electric aviation? Is it less emission of CO2 and carbon gas? Or what are the main drivers there?
So I think across different sectors, there's lots of momentum in different ways. For me, I think it really comes down to the cities that regulate ahead of everybody else. You know, the fact, we keep on talking about it, but you know, Oslo being, you can only have hybrid or electric cars in Oslo now. Paris saying 2030. It's those cities that are stepping ahead of the curve. And in a way, it's just the same as they did when they introduced no smoking or congestion charge or all the other sort of city-centered taxation systems that they put in place. They provide the space and the inertia that make people think, okay, it's credible now. Serving Paris, serving Mexico, serving New York, there's enough of a market there that it's no longer a fringe thing. And countries are generally following on 5 to 10 years after the cities. So I think seeing those leading cities as the catalysts of change, that's really important. But then also sort of behind the scenes, the cost of solar falling, the cost of electric storage falling, it's, you know, going down, solar down below $1 per kilowatt, etc. These price points that people have talked about for decades are now being crossed. So now it's just a case of, okay, so everything's affordable. It's where, it's not a question of what, it's a question of where does things happen first.
Okay, thank you. Do you think, Tim, is it more the governments doing something? You mentioned London, Paris, Norway, etc., where it's very much governmental driven, or do you think that the customers will be also drivers of like asking for more sustainable products and services?
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, obviously in places, going back to the air quality thing, where people were having problems breathing, where asthma is on the increase, where there's daily smog, you can't help but people start to change their behaviors irrespective of government policy. But I think else, generally, and I hasten to say it's less about country level, and I said more about city level. That's where the changes are taking place. But definitely, you know, and again, it's difficult to have a global perspective on this because there is no singular answer. But you look at some of the behavior changes in China, you look at some of the things going on in Mexico, and there is definite momentum there that this is not right. We need to move. If we've got a choice where an electric car costs the same as a petrol car or gasoline car, that's when the customers will go, okay, fine. And I think that's the key point that we've hit it, particularly with things like with transport. It's all been behind the scenes. There's been so much subsidy going on of oil prices and things like that. But now the price points have changed. It becomes more of a customer choice. Oh, there's a question about hydrogen versus e-cars from Diane. I think the world seems to have jumped onto electric vehicles and slightly forgotten that hydrogen's going to have big impact in certain locations. Clearly, it's tricky to move around compared to electricity. But I think whether it's Japan, whether it's Germany, whether it's specific locations like Singapore, hydrogen will very much be part of the mix. And they have to remember that the big criticism that people always make about electric cars is not just the environmental impact of the batteries, but the electricity's got to have come from somewhere. So it's fine if it's France and it's come from nuclear. It's fine if it's Norway and it's come from hydro and wind. But it's not fine if it's a country where actually the electricity came from a coal-fired power station in the first place. So the fact that this whole debate about which is cleaner, hydrogen or electric, but also which is easier to use and which is easier for big countries versus small countries, that's all part of the mix.
Yes, and I also think that when we are talking about the future of transportation, we always think just about cars for our personal transportation. We are not thinking about trains. We are not thinking about buses. We are not thinking about trucks where hydrogen powered would be quite easier or maybe even better. And
Exactly.
we did not talk about clean shipping in general and clean ships, which is also, if you think about these diesel engines which we are having in ships, which is a big problem.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we have time for 1.5 new questions, and as we have been so much on this sustainability thing now, I want to raise the question on stakeholder society. So we are talking about stakeholder involvement for something like 30+ years now. So why is it now in the top 10, and what are the changes to 5 years ago?
So I think, conscious of time, I think there's three things there. It's about momentum has built up, and there's enough good examples of companies being run in a different way. I think the activism around the inequality that is the wealthy controlling so much of the world's money, and the link between wealth inequality, health inequality, and education inequality are all been coming apparent. That you sort of had a tipping point that the answer is to stop taking all the money and giving it to shareholders. Yes, they have some of it, but the purpose behind most of the organizations in the world was not to make money just for a few people. It was to benefit wider society. And so we've gone full circle from 200 years ago, but it all seems to be coming together very strongly now.
Thank you so much, Tim. We are running out of time, and we promise that we will be ready at 17:00, which is done. Hope to see you all next time in Berlin, hopefully in presence again, and have a good proceeding of ISPIM Global Conference.